The story of Édouard Manet begins not only with his birth in Paris in 1832, but within a cultural and political environment undergoing deep transformations. Born into a bourgeois family of considerable means and influence, Manet was positioned at the intersection of traditional values and the brewing spirit of modernity. His upbringing provided him both the comfort of elite privilege and the intellectual exposure necessary to nurture an independent mind. In retrospect, this duality would become a central tension in his life and work. Manet's father, Auguste Manet, was a high-ranking official in the French Ministry of Justice, known for his conservative views and aspirations for his son to pursue a respectable career in law. His mother, Eugénie Desirée Fournier, came from a lineage that included diplomats and artists, and she played a subtler yet crucial role in encouraging Édouard's early artistic sensibilities. This parental dichotomy, rigid paternal expectation versus maternal cultural openness, would define the complex framework in which Manet's creativity first took root. Education was of prime importance in the Manet household. As a young student, Édouard attended the prestigious College Rollin, where he proved to be more inclined toward literature and the arts than toward rigorous academics. He was particularly drawn to caricature and sketching, often filling his notebooks with drawings that revealed a natural inclination for observation and form. While his father disapproved of such pursuits, the young Manet found quiet encouragement from an uncle, Edmond Fournier, who introduced him to the Louvre and the works of the old masters. This early exposure to the classical canon had a profound effect on Manet, not by reinforcing adherence to tradition, but by instilling a critical eye toward it. Even as a boy, he began to question the stiff formalism of academic art, gravitating instead toward works that captured vitality, ambiguity, and the human experience. Such early influences laid the groundwork for his future rebellion against the École des Beaux-Arts and the conservative expectations of the French Academy. At the age of 16, in an effort to divert him from the arts, his father attempted to steer him toward a naval career. Manet failed the entrance exam to the naval school and was subsequently sent on a training voyage to Rio de Janeiro. This experience, while initially intended as a corrective measure, would prove formative in an entirely different way. The vivid imagery of foreign lands, the maritime atmosphere, and the dramatic interplay of light and color encountered on this voyage stirred something elemental in his artistic vision. It was during this time that he began to solidify his resolve to become a painter. Upon returning to France, and after a second failed attempt at the naval exam, Manet was finally permitted to pursue art. He enrolled in the studio of Thomas Couture, a popular academic painter known for his historical scenes and large-scale compositions. However, even in this relatively liberal environment, Manet quickly grew disillusioned with the constraints of academic style. Couture emphasized idealized form and moral narratives, but Manet was more interested in capturing fleeting moments, real people, and the atmosphere of contemporary life. This dissonance would ultimately lead him to chart his own path. In addition to his formal training, Manet was a frequent visitor to the Louvre, where he copied works by Titian, Velázquez, Goya, and Rubens. Of these, it was the Spanish painters, particularly Velázquez and Goya, who left the deepest mark. He admired their stark realism, dramatic contrasts, and unflinching portrayals of human vulnerability. These influences would later manifest in his own controversial works, in which the line between homage and innovation would blur provocatively. Beyond technique, Manet's formative years were shaped by the intellectual and political currents of post-revolutionary France. The instability of the July Monarchy, the Revolution of 1848, and the rise of the Second Empire under Napoleon III were not mere background events. They were part of the atmosphere he breathed. Conversations about liberty, the role of the artist, and the shifting structures of power were central to the salons and cafes he frequented. These dialogues sharpened his critical lens and emboldened his sense of social observation. Manet's early social circle also contributed significantly to his development. He gravitated toward bohemian and literary communities, where he met thinkers, poets, and other painters who were challenging the status quo. He became a close reader of Baudelaire, whose concept of modernity as the fleeting, ephemeral experience of urban life resonated deeply with him. This engagement with the avant-garde was not only aesthetic but ideological. It reinforced his belief that art should reflect the immediacy of the present. Paris, in the mid-19th century, was a city of contradictions, at once imperial and insurgent, opulent and chaotic. Against the backdrop of cobbled streets, gaslit boulevards, and rumbling omnibuses, Édouard Manet returned from his naval voyage with a quiet certainty. The boy who had sailed to Rio de Janeiro with expectations of discipline and duty came back with something else, a hunger for expression that could not be contained by uniforms or ship logs. There was a new light in his eyes, not from the tropics, but from the clarity that only comes with inner resolve. The studio of Thomas Couture, nestled in the heart of Paris, buzzed with aspiring artists, all eager to absorb the wisdom of a man who had once dazzled the salon. The smell of oil paint, turpentine, and charcoal clung to the air like perfume. Manet entered this space with cautious enthusiasm. He was not yet a rebel, not yet the instigator of scandalous canvases, but his posture already held a quiet defiance. While others dutifully mimicked classical poses, he searched for something in the folds of fabric, in the subtle gesture of a hand that felt closer to life. Couture's studio was a place of discipline and ambition. Students labored for hours on large canvases, copying historical scenes, learning to idealize the human form. Manet, however, often wandered from the prescribed path. He preferred small sketches in the margins, expressive brushwork that betrayed an impatience with polish. His fellow students noticed this. Some saw it as arrogance, others as courage. But none could deny that Manet brought something unpredictable into the room, a looseness of hand paired with an intensity of gaze. When the day's lessons ended, Manet often escaped to the streets. He would stroll the quays of the Seine or linger at the Palais Royal, his sketch pad ever ready. He was drawn not to the monuments of Paris, but to the people, street musicians, market vendors, beggars, and passers-by lost in thought. He sketched quickly, instinctively. These drawings, never intended for public view, would later serve as seeds for his most iconic works. They bore witness to his fascination with gesture, character, and the ephemeral drama of everyday life. His artistic curiosity was not limited to the human figure. He developed an early fascination with light, not simply its play on surfaces, but its ability to construct and dismantle form. In the late afternoons, he would sometimes visit the Jardin des Plantes, not for its animals or exotic flora, but to watch how shadows fell across the gravel paths, how tree leaves danced in the sun. For Manet, light was never just a backdrop. It was a character capable of contradiction, seduction, and revelation. Despite his discontent with academic convention, Manet remained deeply committed to understanding painting on his own terms. He spent countless hours at the Louvre, copying not the most celebrated canvases, but those that intrigued him. He returned again and again to the dark realism of Spanish masters. While others admired Raphael, he stood mesmerized before the stoic dignity of Velázquez Las Meninas, or the haunting defiance in Goya's The 3rd of May. These were not just studies, they were conversations across time. Beyond technical skill, Manet sought something more elusive, truth. But his idea of truth was not tethered to morality or narrative clarity. It was sensorial, momentary, and subjective. He once wrote to a friend that painting, for him, was not about telling a story, but about capturing the breath of a second. This philosophy put him at odds with his instructor, and after 6 years with Couture, he made the decisive break. He would not graduate with honors, nor carry the imprimatur of the Academy, but he would carry his vision intact. Free from institutional oversight, Manet established his first independent studio in 1856. It was modest in size, its windows looking out onto a quiet street. But for Manet, it was a sanctuary. Here, he began painting portraits of his family, still lives, and street scenes with renewed focus. The brushwork became bolder, the colors less restrained. He began to experiment with spatial compression, flatness, and abrupt juxtapositions, techniques that would later confound critics and influence generations of painters. It was during this time that he began forming close ties with Parisian intellectuals. His circle expanded to include journalists, poets, and critics who would later champion his work. He read voraciously, particularly French and Spanish literature, and often discussed the arts over absinthe or wine at the Café Gerbois. These conversations, often heated, helped shape his understanding of modern life, not just as a theme, but as a condition to be confronted on canvas. The 1860s in Paris were years of elegance and tension, a gilded facade masking social unrest and a simmering desire for artistic renewal. For Édouard Manet, it was a decade of transformation, a period when he stepped fully into the public eye, not as a student or a promising talent, but as an artist determined to dismantle convention from within. His studio became a laboratory of defiance, and each canvas a quiet but deliberate provocation. At this point in his career, Manet began to pursue the Salon, the official art exhibition sponsored by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, as a strategic battleground. It was not approval he sought, but visibility. The Salon was both the apex of institutional authority and the greatest stage for public debate in the art world. Manet knew its influence could not be ignored, even as he prepared to challenge its standards with every brushstroke. His early submissions were unlike anything the juries were used to seeing. While the majority of Salon entries clung to historical grandeur or mythological themes rendered in pristine polish, Manet offered scenes rooted in contemporary life, compositions that teetered between realism and abstraction, clarity and ambiguity. His 1861 painting The Spanish Singer was accepted and even won an honorable mention, but it was a calculated compromise, cloaked in Spanish exoticism that masked the radical undertones of his technique. Soon after, the veil of diplomacy fell away. Manet began to paint with increasing boldness, stripping away the allegorical camouflage that had protected his work. His figures stood in stark, theatrical poses, often gazing directly at the viewer with unsettling intensity. He collapsed the space between subject and observer, rejecting the smooth transitions and atmospheric depth so cherished by academic painters. Where they sought harmony, he introduced friction. One of his boldest decisions was his treatment of the human figure. Manet rendered bodies with a directness that eschewed idealization, emphasizing structure over seduction. Skin was painted in broad, flat areas of color. Contours were abrupt and unapologetically visible. Shadows were no longer gentle gradients, but harsh interruptions. These choices imbued his subjects with an almost sculptural presence, and yet they pulsed with life, imperfect, unvarnished, and defiantly real. Even his backgrounds resisted traditional perspective. Rather than leading the eye into a deep, illusionistic space, Manet flattened his settings. Often, they resembled stage sets, minimal, symbolic, almost abstract. A light wall, a dark curtain, a patch of sky. They were not environments, but signs deliberately constructed to foreground the figures they enclosed. This compression gave his paintings a sense of immediacy, of confrontation. The viewer was not invited in gently, but forced to stand before the work and reckon with it. Color, too, became a weapon in Manet's arsenal. He abandoned the muddy browns and sepias that defined much of the academic palette, replacing them with luminous blacks, rich blues, and sudden bursts of white or vermilion. He once declared, "There are no lines in nature, only areas of color, one against another." In this belief, he aligned himself not with tradition, but with a burgeoning aesthetic that would later fuel Impressionism. Critics were not kind. His 1863 Submission Young Man in the costume of a Majo was derided as coarse and unfinished. Another work, Lola de Valence, was dismissed as a parody of Spanish painting. The press accused him of incompetence, of mockery, even of moral decay. Yet amid the scandal, Manet stood firm. He did not defend his choices with lofty declarations. He let the paintings speak, challenging the viewer to confront the modern world not as a myth, but as it was, raw, ambiguous, and unresolved. Outside the walls of the salon, whispers of a new art began to circulate. A younger generation of painters, Monet, Renoir, Bazille, were watching Manet closely, absorbing his fearlessness. While they would later diverge stylistically, they recognized in him a kind of spiritual leader, a man who had dared to paint what others would not even sketch. To them, Manet was not simply painting modern life. He was living it, embracing the contradictions, tensions, and ruptures that defined their era. In the spring of 1863, a painting appeared in the Salon de Refuses that would rupture the delicate boundary between convention and modernity. Amid walls covered with artworks rejected by the official Salon jury, one canvas in particular provoked laughter, outrage, and fascination in equal measure. It was Édouard Manet's Luc Déjeuner, Sir L. Herb, a monumental composition that would soon become a lightning rod in the cultural battles of the 19th century. In this painting, the young artist had not merely challenged artistic tradition, he had detonated it. The scene was deceptively simple. Two fully clothed men, dressed in contemporary garb, seated casually in a sun-dappled forest clearing. Beside them, a naked woman, gazing directly and unflinchingly at the viewer, reclined on the grass. In the shallow background, another partially dressed woman bathed in a stream. The setting evoked a picnic, yet the mood was unsettling. There was no narrative justification for the nudity, no mythological pretext, no allegorical veil. The confrontation between the mundane and the erotic was not explained. It simply existed as natural and jarring as daylight. What shocked viewers most was not the nudity itself, but its context. The classical nude had long been a staple of art history, but always cloaked in the acceptable forms of mythology, Venus, Diana, or nymphs of antiquity. Manet stripped that context away. His naked woman was no goddess, but a real individual. She bore the face of Victorine Meurent, a model and aspiring artist known in the Parisian art circles. Her body was rendered not with idealized smoothness, but with stark contrasts and visible brushwork. Her gaze, direct and unapologetic, defied centuries of passive female representation. The composition itself was equally radical. Inspired by Renaissance works like Titian's Pastoral Concert and Raphael's Judgment of Paris, Manet borrowed the structure of old master paintings only to distort it. The perspective was disjointed. The figures appeared oddly flattened, the depth compressed. The light illuminated each element in isolation rather than unifying the scene. The brushstrokes, brisk and visible, defied the polished surface expected of finished works. It was not an imitation of nature, but a challenge to how nature had been represented in painting. The uproar at the Salon de Refuses was immediate. Crowds gathered before the canvas, laughing, jeering, whispering. Critics accused Manet of vulgarity, of incompetence, even of madness. They mocked the woman's pallid skin, the men's bourgeois attire, the odd spatial inconsistencies. Some called it a joke, others a provocation. But even those who despised it could not look away. Luc Desgenais sur l'Herbe had accomplished something extraordinary. It had made the public feel, react, and question what art could be. For Manet, the scandal was not unexpected. He had painted the work knowing it would provoke, but he had also painted it with conviction, believing deeply in the necessity of bringing art into the present. In his eyes, the subject was neither obscene nor flippant. It was simply truthful, an unembellished reflection of the modern world, stripped of academic pretense. He later explained that art should concern itself with the life of its time, not escape into the safety of myth. With Le Desgenais sur l'Herbe, he declared his allegiance to the here and now. The model, Victorine Meurent, played a crucial role in this vision. Far from being a passive muse, she collaborated actively with Manet, embodying characters with boldness and intelligence. In this painting, she is not an object of desire to be consumed by the male gaze, but a subject who stares back, who asserts presence. Her nudity is not seductive, but confrontational. In placing a known woman in a classical pose without the veil of symbolism, Manet forced the audience to consider her as a person, not a myth. The painting's technical innovations were equally significant. Manet employed a high-contrast palette, punctuated by abrupt transitions of color and form. The green of the forest floor clashed against the black of the men's coats, the porcelain skin against the rich tones of the still life in the foreground. These juxtapositions created tension within the composition, a kind of visual dissonance that echoed the cultural dissonance the painting provoked. He was not interested in visual harmony. He was staging a confrontation between reality and expectation. The fallout from Luc Desgenais sur l'Herbe extended beyond the Salon. It reverberated through the art world, galvanizing younger artists and emboldening them to pursue their own experiments. Claude Monet, Paul Cézanne, and Berthe Morisot all saw in Manet a leader, someone unafraid to break with convention. Though Manet himself never fully identified with the emerging Impressionist group, his painting became a foundational stone in their movement. He had cracked the wall of academic tradition, and through the fracture, a new art would emerge. Even today, Luc Desgenais sur l'Herbe continues to unsettle and inspire. It stands not just as a painting, but as a manifesto. In 1865, Édouard Manet once again submitted a painting to the Salon that would ignite a firestorm of controversy, perhaps even greater than that caused by Luc Desgenais sur l'Herbe. This new work, titled Olympia, depicted a reclining nude woman, serene, stark, and unrepentant. Unlike the mythological nymphs or goddesses of classical art, this woman was unmistakably real. She did not float in an idealized dreamscape. She lay on a crumpled bed, surrounded by details as domestic as they were disconcerting. Olympia was painted with cool precision and deliberate defiance. The nude figure rests on white linens, adorned with nothing but a ribbon around her neck, a bracelet on her wrist, and a flower in her hair. A black cat arches its back at her feet, feral, alert, and emblematic of a sexuality that, though unspoken, permeates the entire composition. At the edge of the canvas, a black maid presents a bouquet of flowers, perhaps from an unseen admirer. The gaze of a nude, however, remains fixed, direct, unreadable, unmoved. It was not the nudity that scandalized the salon audience, but the context and the presentation. Olympia was not a goddess, not a myth. She was a courtesan. This was unmistakable to any Parisian viewer of the time. Her name, her posture, the accessories strewn across the bed, all pointed toward a woman of independent agency, and by extension, moral ambiguity. The fact that she looked the viewer in the eye with no shame, no coyness, was a rupture in decorum few were prepared to accept. Critics reacted with vitriol. They called her corpse-like, her body unappealing, her stare offensive. They accused Manet of mocking the tradition of the nude, of violating the sanctity of art. One reviewer lamented, "She is the queen of spades, with the face of a fierce and fastidious servant." The backlash was not merely aesthetic. It was deeply cultural, a reflection of 19th century discomfort with female agency, with the merging of realism and sexuality in public view. Manet's brushwork in Olympia was as revolutionary as the subject. Gone were the soft transitions and warm tones of academic painting. He used abrupt contrasts, flattening the image into bold planes of color. The bed, the figure, the drapery, all existed on the same visual plane, rejecting the illusionistic depth that characterized traditional compositions. Shadows were not modulated into gentle gradients, but painted as distinct swaths of darkness, giving the work a stark and confrontational immediacy. Equally provocative was the presence of the maid, an unusual inclusion in a painting of this genre. She is not a servant in the background, but a participant in the composition. Her dark complexion contrasts with Olympia's pale skin, forming a visual polarity that emphasized the racial and class dimensions embedded in the scene. This dual presence of privilege and servitude, whiteness and blackness, brought layers of socio-political tension to the canvas that contemporary audiences scarcely acknowledged but could not ignore. The composition also broke from narrative clarity. Unlike historical or mythological nudes, where context is embedded in story, Olympia offered no explanatory backdrop. The viewer is left to interpret the bouquet, the cat, the expression, the glance. This lack of guiding narrative was disorienting. It asked the audience to confront the painting not as a tale, but as a confrontation, a dialogue between viewer and subject with no easy resolution. Despite the public outcry, Manet remained unapologetic. He stood by his work with characteristic resolve, believing that the painter's task was to portray life as it is, not as tradition demanded. Olympia was not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but an honest rendering of a reality that society preferred to ignore. It was Paris unmasked. His aim was not to provoke, but to reveal. And in revealing, he changed the function of art from decoration to inquiry. The impact of Olympia reverberated through artistic circles. Painters like Degas and Cezanne saw in it a blueprint for the future, a rejection of sentimentality, a commitment to the moment. Writers, too, took note. Émile Zola defended the work, declaring that it bore the scent of truth. The painting became a landmark, not just for its audacity, but for the way it reframed the nude as a site of social and philosophical tension. It was not a fantasy, but a question: who is seen and how? Who controls the gaze? In the years following its exhibition, Olympia would become one of the defining works of modern art. Museums, once reluctant to display, it would later honor it as a masterwork. And while its controversy would eventually fade, its power never did. For in Olympia's gaze, cool, unflinching, indifferent, there remains the seed of modernism itself. The refusal to flatter, the courage to disturb, and the insistence that art need not comfort, only confront. As the 1860s unfurled, Édouard Manet's career blossomed amidst the intricate, often contentious web of Paris's intellectual and artistic circles. Far from the quiet solitude of a studio, Manet's world was one of lively cafes, spirited debates, and impassioned conversations. Venues where politics, art, and philosophy collided in an unrestrained exchange of ideas. The city, ever alive with revolution, was a fertile ground for the avant-garde, and it was in these intellectual and artistic communities that Manet found both support and challenge. The Café Gerbois, located in the heart of Paris, became a second home for Manet and his growing circle. A place where the unconventional minds of the time gathered to discuss literature, politics, and art. The café was an incubator for new ideas. It was here that the young Impressionists, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Frédéric Bazille, met regularly with Manet, absorbing his bold vision. These meetings were not merely social gatherings, but charged intellectual exchanges, full of experimentation and artistic ambition. The debates were intense, often heated, but beneath the intellectual conflict was a shared passion for breaking free from academic traditions. The café's patrons were not only painters, but also writers and critics. Figures like Émile Zola and Stéphane Mallarmé, who found in Manet's work a kindred spirit. Zola, the celebrated writer and later a vocal defender of Manet, saw in the painter's bold compositions a mirror of the shifting values in French society. To Zola, Manet was a prophet of modern life, and his depictions of everyday reality spoke directly to the turbulent changes occurring in the streets of Paris and the wider world. Manet, in turn, would often engage Zola in conversation, delighting in his sharp wit and the writer's advocacy of the truth in art. The significance of these intellectual and artistic exchanges cannot be overstated. They shaped Manet's outlook on art as a tool for both personal expression and social commentary. While many of his contemporaries were content to produce works that merely celebrated nature or idealized the past, Manet sought to confront the present in all its complexity. He found inspiration not only in the canvases of old masters like Velázquez and Goya, but also in the literature of his time. Works that explored the human condition, the realities of industrial life, and the complexities of modernity. These writers, much like the painters around him, were rejecting romanticism in favor of confronting the raw, unembellished truths of contemporary life. At the same time, the artist's relationships with intellectuals helped Manet to refine his views on art's role in society. Far from being a passive recipient of intellectual thought, he actively contributed to the shaping of avant-garde ideas, positioning himself as both a provocateur and a thinker. He was, in this sense, not just an artist, but an intellectual in his own right, someone who used the canvas as a vehicle for his ideas about the world. In this circle, Manet's works were not only seen as innovations in technique, but as statements of modernity. His art was viewed as a reflection of the rapidly changing society around him, one in which conventions were being questioned and old structures were being dismantled. Yet, for all the support he received from the avant-garde intellectuals and artists, Manet remained a figure of controversy. His embrace of modern life as the subject of his paintings was still a radical position. His contemporaries in the more conservative factions of the art world, those who clung to academic standards, saw him as a traitor to tradition. These critics were particularly appalled by his rejection of classical ideals, his use of modern subjects, and his technique of painting with visible, almost aggressive brushstrokes. To them, Manet's works were unpolished, too raw, too real. However, The very artists and intellectuals who supported Manet would also become the recipients of his greatest challenges. In the salons and cafes, Manet's bold ideas often provoked reactions as fiery as those he received in the public sphere. He would, at times, clash with other avant-garde figures, particularly those who gravitated towards Impressionism, like Monet, who painted softer, more atmospheric works. Manet, who was not yet ready to embrace the full vagaries of Impressionism, still believed that form and structure were vital and often found the emphasis on light and color alone to be insufficient. Despite this, Manet would continue to maintain close relationships with the younger artists, offering them guidance and a sense of intellectual kinship. Among the most significant relationships was his deep friendship with the writer and critic Charles Baudelaire, whose revolutionary views on art mirrored Manet's own. Baudelaire's theories on beauty, which centered on the idea that modern life itself was a worthy subject for art, greatly influenced Manet's approach. Baudelaire saw beauty not in idealized forms or distant historical narratives, but in the streets, in the faces of the modern city. He argued that artists had an obligation to represent the contemporary world as it was, not as it had been romanticized in the past. Manet, guided by Baudelaire's ideas, began to paint not just landscapes or figures, but the raw, unrefined details of everyday life. Prostitutes, cafes, the working class. And in doing so, he rejected the grand historical and mythological themes that had once dominated art. The intellectual climate surrounding Manet also brought him into contact with the radical political movements of the time. Paris in the 1860s was a city on the brink of political upheaval. The years leading up to the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune were fraught with tension. Intellectuals, writers, and artists were all grappling with the question of social justice, the rights of the individual, and the role of the state. Manet's association with these movements would deepen as he reflected on the role of the artist in times of social change. For Manet, art was not merely an aesthetic pursuit, but a means to address social truths and provoke political thought. The emergence of photography in the mid-19th century had an undeniable impact on the art world, and no artist felt its influence more profoundly than Édouard Manet. As the new medium gained popularity, it brought with it both a challenge and a catalyst for artists like Manet. The camera, with its mechanical precision and ability to freeze moments in time, was a force that threatened to render traditional painting obsolete. However, rather than resisting this new technology, Manet embraced it, using it as a tool to redefine his approach to visual representation. Photography, which had developed rapidly since the daguerreotype's invention in the 1830s, captured the world with unprecedented accuracy. Its ability to immortalize fleeting moments, details of daily life, and even the most intimate expressions of human emotion presented a new way of seeing. For Manet, this innovation was not merely a technical advancement, it was a philosophical shift. The very notion of capturing a moment in time, unaltered and raw, resonated deeply with his own aspirations in painting. If photography could record reality with precision, then painting, for him, could explore not just the surface, but the deeper psychological and emotional layers beneath. In Le Déjeuner, Sir L. Herb, for instance, the abruptness of the figures, the starkness of the background, and the artificiality of the composition bore a striking resemblance to photographic portraits, where the subjects were often posed in the same way, directly engaging with the viewer. The spatial distortions in his paintings, where figures often seem cropped or unfinished, echoed the snapshot qualities of photography. Where classical painters had adhered to a more traditional, idealized vision of space and perspective, Manet's works seemed to offer a more fragmented, instantaneous perspective. one that might appear in a photograph taken in the heat of the moment. Manet's own fascination with photography became evident as he began to experiment with the subject matter and structure of his works. In several of his paintings, he consciously replicated photographic compositions. A notable example is his 1868 work The Fifer, where the central figure of a young boy playing a fife is presented in such a way that the composition appears almost cropped, as if part of the figure is missing, much like the edge of a photographic frame. The isolation of the figure within the frame and the juxtaposition of the fifer's bright uniform against a dark background recalls the stark simplicity of a photographic portrait. One of the key aspects of photography that Manet incorporated into his paintings was the immediacy with which it captured the modern world. Photography, unlike traditional portraiture, did not require the subject to adhere to the old conventions of aristocratic pose and grandeur. Instead, it embraced ordinary life, the ephemeral moments that were typically overlooked in academic painting. For Manet, the world of everyday people, the bustling streets, the workers, the cafes, the parks, was just as worthy of artistic representation as the noble myths or the historical epics that had long dominated painting. In this, Manet was responding to the rise of photography with a deliberate subversion. While photographers captured reality, Manet sought to engage with it more deeply. Where photography could reproduce a likeness, Manet could offer an interpretation, an insight into the psyche of his subjects. His works, such as Olympia, moved beyond mere likeness, using distortion, light, and color to explore the emotional and social complexities of the moment. Manet's figures did not merely stand still like subjects in a photograph. They exuded tension, personality, and complexity. In some of Manet's later works, the influence of photography becomes even more pronounced. The composition of the railway, 1873, for example, echoes the framing techniques used in photographic portraiture and street photography. The positioning of the figures, the sense of cropped space, and the sharp contrast between light and dark all suggest a world viewed through the lens of camera. The woman and child are isolated within the frame, and the background, which includes the smoke from a passing train, is reduced to a blur, reminiscent of the focus techniques used in photographs to direct attention to a particular subject. Manet's work often demonstrated the photographic principle of capturing a fleeting moment in time. In contrast to the slow, calculated process of academic painting, photography operated with speed, allowing for the spontaneity and immediacy that Manet admired. This sense of capturing the here and now was reflected in his ability to create works that felt like a snapshot, a moment frozen and full of urgency. The brushwork in many of his later works, like The Railway, is quick and direct, providing a sense of movement and immediacy akin to a photographic flash. In the context of The Railway, the figure of the woman in the foreground, engrossed in her thoughts as the train passes by, feels as though she is unaware of the viewer's gaze, captured in the middle of her own personal moment, much as one might catch a subject unawares in a candid photograph. There's a certain intimacy in this, of vulnerability, as though we are witnessing a private world briefly exposed. This kind of momentary exposure was something photography had brought to the forefront, an art of interruption, of glimpsing a subject in its natural state, and this is precisely what Manet replicated in his paintings. As the 1870s wore on, Manet's work continued to be influenced by photography's ability to capture and dissect reality. But he did not simply imitate photographic methods. Rather, he allowed the medium to challenge him, pushing his painting towards new forms of expression. While photography had the power to document, Manet still saw painting as a vehicle for interpretation. More than just capturing what was before him, He sought to express the internal emotions, tensions, and psychological depth that could not be fully represented through a photograph. The year 1870 brought to France a seismic shift, both politically and personally, for Édouard Manet. The Franco-Prussian War, which erupted that summer, would not only redefine the fate of the French nation, but also deeply affect the course of Manet's life and art. As the country fell into conflict, so too did Manet's focus shift from the urban, modern life he had long painted, to a more somber engagement with the turbulent moment unfolding around him. For Manet, the war was more than a backdrop for the historical events of the time. It was a source of profound personal reflection and artistic transformation. When France declared war on Prussia in July 1870, Manet found himself caught up in the fervor of national pride and the atmosphere of a country on the brink of catastrophe. The French, with their long-standing belief in their superiority, were confident of a swift victory. But this confidence quickly evaporated as the conflict unfolded. France was caught off guard, and the French army was decisively defeated. The rapid fall of the Second Empire led to the proclamation of the French Third Republic in September 1870. The war had ignited a storm of political, social, and emotional upheaval, not only for France, but for its artists. Manet, like many of his contemporaries, was affected by the war, though not in the way one might expect. He did not take to the battlefield as other artists might have in the past, attempting to document the heroics or the carnage of war. Instead, Manet remained in Paris, where he turned his gaze inward, wrestling with the implications of the war and its impact on the French psyche. It was this very tension, the national humiliation, the loss of pride, and the devastating consequences of the war, that fueled Manet's later work. His earlier, vibrant depictions of modern life, full of joy and celebration, gave way to a more introspective and somber tone. While the rest of Paris suffered under the siege, Manet's art began to reflect the political fragmentation and the growing anxiety that permeated society. In his studio, he began working on several pieces that subtly alluded to the conflict, including the execution of Emperor Maximilian, 1867 to 1868, which, although painted before the war, gained new meaning in light of the recent upheavals. The painting, which depicted the execution of the Austrian emperor in Mexico, was a commentary on power, authority, and the fragility of empires, an ironic echo of France's own fall from grace. The war also brought with it profound personal challenges for Manet. The painter's political leanings were complex, and although he was no nationalist, he was fiercely devoted to the ideals of liberty and the rights of the individual. As the siege of Paris continued, Manet's work became more heavily infused with themes of loss and suffering, reflecting the deep national trauma. The idea of the wounded hero, which had long been a theme in traditional art, was rendered irrelevant in the context of the war's brutal reality. The soldiers who once fought in battle as figures of romantic heroism were now depicted as broken, defeated, and discarded. During the siege of Paris, when the city was cut off from the rest of France, Manet's work took on an even darker tone. He painted with an increasingly sparse and muted palette, often focusing on still lives and quiet domestic scenes rather than the bustling modern life he had previously so adored. In Still Life with Plums, 1872, for example, the artist painted fruit, its seemingly simple subject matter conveying an atmosphere of melancholy and disillusionment. The once vibrant energy of the world Manet had captured in his earlier works now appeared distant and fragmented, as if the very essence of life had been stripped away by the horrors of war. Manet's stylistic evolution during the war was also marked by a shift in his approach to form and composition. The figures that had once appeared distinct and clearly defined now seemed more fragmented, less certain. This visual disintegration mirrored the disarray of French society. In works such as The Railway, 1873, the sharp, fragmented shapes and contrasts in the painting hinted at a world in chaos. The woman in the foreground, absorbed in thought, seemed disconnected from her surroundings, reflecting a society fractured by the war. The war also had a significant effect on Manet's social circle. The intellectual and artistic communities in Paris were torn apart by political divisions, with some artists and critics rallying behind the Republicans, while others sided with the conservative factions. Manet himself was largely silent on his political views during the war, preferring to focus on his art rather than publicly declare his stance. This political neutrality, however, did not shield him from the social unrest of the time. The collapse of the Second Empire and the subsequent upheaval led to the fall of many old institutions, which affected Manet's professional standing. Despite the growing turmoil, Manet's reputation as a leading figure in the avant-garde remained intact. His works continued to be shown at the Salon, though his participation in these exhibitions became increasingly marked by tension. The conventional art world had been slow to accept Manet's modernity, and with the war, many conservative critics began to question his relevance in the shifting political climate. They accused him of being too focused on the trivialities of modern life, at a time when France needed more than ever a return to traditional ideals of heroism and sacrifice. In contrast to his critics, Manet's circle of artists and intellectuals grew more tightly knit. His connections with the emerging Impressionists, artists like Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Camille Pissarro, became a crucial support network. These painters, though often criticized for their unconventional techniques, found in Manet a figure who not only understood the importance of capturing the fleeting moment, but also the political and emotional weight of the era. With the conclusion of the war, the effects of the conflict on French society were far-reaching, and the trauma of the siege and the collapse of the French Empire lingered. Manet's work during and after the war can be seen as an attempt to process the raw emotions of loss, defeat, and uncertainty. The French had lost their war, their empire, and their sense of invincibility. In his paintings, Manet's focus turned inward, capturing not just the face of society, but its fractured spirit. As the 1870s came to a close, Édouard Manet, who had once been a beacon of youthful energy and vibrant creativity, found himself facing a profound personal and physical decline. The years following the Franco-Prussian War had brought with them not only the weight of political and social upheaval, but also the burden of increasingly fragile health. For Manet, the artistic victories of his earlier years were now tempered by physical limitations that would ultimately define his final decade. Manet had long struggled with illness, but it was in the 1870s that his health began to deteriorate with alarming speed. In 1879, at the age of 47, he began to experience symptoms that would soon be diagnosed as syphilis, a disease that had long been known for its debilitating effects. By this time, Manet had been living with the disease for several years, though its impact on his body and mind had not fully manifested until much later. The progression of his illness was slow and insidious, but the effects on his energy, his emotional well-being, and his ability to work were undeniable. As his illness worsened, Manet found himself unable to maintain the same pace of creative output that had once defined his life. The once vibrant social gatherings at the Café Gerbois, where he had enjoyed spirited discussions with fellow artists and intellectuals, became fewer and farther between. His work, too, began to reflect the toll that his declining health was taking on him. The earlier vibrancy and daring innovation of his brushwork gradually gave way to a more somber, introspective tone, as if the artist himself was becoming more withdrawn from the world he had once so energetically depicted. Despite his growing isolation, Manet continued to paint, though the subjects and styles of his work began to shift. No longer was he focusing solely on the bustling life of Parisian streets or the naked figures of mythology and history. Instead, his later works, like the Bellini, 1879, and Portrait of Nino Costa, 1879, often depicted quieter, more intimate moments. There was a profound stillness in these portraits, and in many ways, they seemed to reflect the introspective mood that had overtaken the artist's life. The figures in these paintings, while rendered with the same skill as earlier works, seemed far more distant, as if they were locked in their own worlds, just as Manet had become in his illness. The toll on Manet's health was compounded by his emotional struggles. The isolation he experienced as his physical condition worsened was made more poignant by the knowledge that his reputation, though secure in the eyes of his fellow artists, was still under siege by the more conservative factions of the French art world. His early triumphs at the Salon had been followed by years of harsh criticism, and while his work had gained widespread recognition among avant-garde circles, the general public remained largely indifferent or hostile. This reality weighed heavily on Manet, who, despite his remarkable contributions to modern art, often felt the sting of rejection and misunderstanding. By 1880, Manet's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer work as he once had. His studio, which had once been a lively space of creation and experimentation, had become a place of quiet solitude. He was increasingly confined to his home, where his energy was consumed by the slow, painful progression of his illness. Though he occasionally made brief forays into the world of art and society, these are becoming less and less frequent. His health, already compromised, was now further weakened by the mental strain of knowing that his time was limited. Throughout this period of decline, Manet's connection to his artistic circle remained strong, though more out of necessity than choice. His friends, including figures like Monet and Renoir, continued to support him, offering encouragement and companionship in the face of his struggle. These relationships were a source of comfort for Manet, who found in the younger generation of Impressionists both a legacy to leave behind and a reminder of the artistic revolution he had helped spark. Yet even as his health failed, Manet's mind remained sharp. He continued to engage with the evolving art world, even though he could no longer physically participate in it with the same vigor. His last significant work, A Bar at the Folies Bergerac, 1882, painted in the final years of his life, is often regarded as one of his most complex and enigmatic works. It reflects not only Manet's mastery of technique, but also his deepening awareness of the disconnection between the self and the world. The painting features a barmaid at the Folies Bergerac, a popular Parisian entertainment venue, but the reflection of the scene in the mirror hints at a world that is both present and absent, an apt metaphor for Manet's own struggle with life and death. The painting also reveals an important aspect of Manet's final years, his continued engagement with the modern world. Even in the face of illness, he refused to turn his back on the present, choosing instead to confront the complexities of contemporary life head-on. The reflective surface of the mirror, which distorts the figures and blurs the boundaries between the viewer and the subject, serves as a powerful symbol of the artist's own internal reflections, his struggle to reconcile his legacy with the painful realities of his life. Despite his best efforts, Manet's health ultimately began to fail irreparably. The disease that had been slowly destroying him for years finally reached its terminal stage. In early 1883, just a few months after completing A Bar at the Folies Bergerac, Manet was forced to undergo surgery to address the complications of his syphilis. The operation was unsuccessful, and on April 30th, 1883, Édouard Manet passed away at the age of 51. The death of Manet marked the end of an era in French art. He was mourned by his contemporaries, many of whom had regarded him not only as a pioneering artist, but also as a personal inspiration. Though Manet's later years were marked by illness and personal hardship, his legacy as one of the founders of modern art was assured. His bold reimaginings of what art could be had paved the way for future generations of artists. And even in his final works, he continued to challenge conventional notions of painting, leaving an indelible mark on the world. Édouard Manet's death in 1883 marked not the end of his significance in the art world, but the beginning of his lasting influence on the trajectory of modern art. Though he never fully achieved the mainstream recognition he deserved during his lifetime, Manet's contributions reverberated throughout the 20th century, shaping the evolution of Western art in profound ways. Today, he is regarded as one of the pivotal figures in the transition from traditional academic painting to the more liberated forms of expression that emerged in the modernist movement. Manet's greatest achievement lay in his ability to challenge established artistic norms. He shattered the conventions of academic painting, particularly the constraints of historical and mythological subjects that had dominated French art for centuries. Through works like Le Déjeuner, Sir Elherbe, and Olympia, he introduced the modern world into the canvas, choosing everyday scenes and ordinary people as subjects. In doing so, he brought forth the raw, unembellished nature of modern life, unafraid to confront themes of sexuality, social alienation, and the changing roles of women in society. At the time of his death, Manet's work was already being embraced by a small but growing community of avant-garde artists, including those who would come to be known as the Impressionists. Manet's relationship with this group was complex, as he was both an ally and a critical figure in the development of the movement. Although he never fully adopted the plein air techniques or the vibrant color palette of the Impressionists, he laid the groundwork for their innovations. His focus on light, his willingness to depict modern life with frankness, and his embrace of more innovative, less controlled brushwork were all hallmarks of the later Impressionist style. Manet's influence extended far beyond the Impressionists, however. His departure from the idealized forms of classical painting set the stage for many other avant-garde movements of the 20th century, including Fauvism, Cubism, and Surrealism. The willingness of artists like Henri Matisse, Pablo Picasso, and even Salvador Dali to explore abstraction, dissonance, and fragmented forms can be traced back to the radical freedom Manet introduced into painting. Where classical art had confined itself to rigid forms, Manet broke open new avenues for personal expression and experimentation. One of the most striking aspects of Manet's work was his approach to composition. His paintings often defied traditional notions of perspective, employing techniques that fragmented space and isolated figures in a way that felt abrupt and unconventional. This disruption of classical norms would become a hallmark of modern art. The influence of Manet's visual language can be seen in the works of artists such as Georges Braque and Juan Gris, who sought to manipulate and deconstruct space in new ways. Manet's fragmented forms and bold, direct brushstrokes were an invitation to challenge the very nature of representation. Moreover, Manet's willingness to depict subjects that had been largely taboo or ignored in high art also paved the way for later artists to explore themes of identity, gender, and class. His portrayal of women, both as sensual objects and as assertive, autonomous figures, was a significant departure from the passive, idealized women of the academic tradition. In works like Olympia and A Bar at the Folies Bergerac, Manet presented women as they were, sometimes defiant, sometimes vulnerable, but always human. These portrayals were both a reflection of the social changes of the time and a challenge to the male-dominated art world. Even in his later years, Manet's engagement with the art world was both revolutionary and elusive. Though he was often criticized during his lifetime, his contemporaries, especially those in the avant-garde community, recognized his role in the transformation of French painting. The connection between Manet and the Impressionists, in particular, was profound. Manet's focus on fleeting moments, his embrace of color, and his innovative compositions were echoed in the works of Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and others. However, unlike the Impressionists, Manet did not abandon the figure in favor of pure light and color. He maintained a strong commitment to human subjects, thus preserving the emotional depth of painting even as he embraced modernity. In the decades following his death, Manet's work became more and more central to the canon of modern art. His inclusion in major exhibitions, both in France and internationally, helped solidify his reputation. By the early 20th century, museums around the world were acquiring his works, and his innovations were recognized not just as important for their time, but as foundational for future developments in painting. His influence can be traced in the works of numerous 20th century movements, including Expressionism, where his bold brushstrokes and raw emotional energy were key inspirations. In Paris, Manet's legacy continued to grow in stature. His works became a standard for younger generations of artists, who saw in him a model of courage and authenticity. For artists such as Marcel Duchamp, Manet represented the ability to provoke and challenge without apology. The very fact that Manet had been misunderstood, critiqued, and even ridiculed during his life gave him an aura of rebellion that many later artists sought to emulate. His influence could be felt in the bold experiments with form and content that emerged during the early 20th century. Critics and scholars, too, began to reassess Manet's role in the history of art. While some had dismissed him during his lifetime as too radical or too simplistic, by the end of the 19th century, there was a growing consensus that Manet had played a decisive role in the transformation of art from the academic tradition to modernism. His ability to balance technical mastery with a daring engagement with modern life made him a central figure in art history. It was not just his paintings that were revolutionary, but his entire approach to the role of the artist in society. In the decades that followed, exhibitions dedicated to Manet's work became a common fixture in major galleries and museums worldwide. These retrospectives allowed new generations of viewers to appreciate his boldness and vision. His work was no longer seen merely as a reaction to the conventions of his time, but as a prophecy of the direction that art would take in the coming century. Today, Manet stands as a foundational figure in the story of modern art, a man who saw the world as it was, and through his genius, was able to reveal it to the world in a way that no one had before. Through his innovative approach to composition, his bold treatment of modern subjects, and his profound influence on subsequent movements, Édouard Manet's legacy endures. His ability to blend the technical achievements of the old masters with the revolutionary spirit of modernism made him a unique figure in the history of art. As such, his place in the pantheon of great artists is secure, and his work continues to inspire, provoke, and challenge artists and viewers alike.